They all ran before the seventh sunrise, and no one in town ever asked why. Because out here in the mountains, silence was easier than truth, and Ethan Cole had long since learned not to explain himself to people who had already made up their minds. His cabin sitting a mile above the last fence line where the wind never quite stopped and the dust settled like it remembered every footstep that came and went. 3 brides in the past year. All gone before the week was through, one leaving her. Boots by the door as if she planned to come back, one riding out before dawn without taking a single thing, and the last one who stood on the porch for a long time, looking at Ethan like she was trying to see something deeper than what was there, before turning away without a word. And the town filled in the silence with stories, said he was cold, said he was strange, said there was something wrong with a man who didn't drink, didn't laugh, didn't even sleep when the lamps went out, but none of them had ever spent a night in that cabin when the wind slipped through the cracks and the dark pressed close enough to feel like it was breathing. None of them had seen the extra plate set quietly on the table each evening, or the way Ethan always left the door unlatched after sunset, not for company, but for something else entirely, something he never spoke about. Because some truths didn't belong to the kind of people who measured a man by gossip and distance, and so the mountain kept its secret, just like Ethan did, until the morning a new figure appeared at the edge of his land, a woman walking alone without hesitation, her steps steady across the dry earth as if she had already chosen her path long before she arrived, her dark hair catching the light, her eyes fixed on the cabin like she wasn't afraid of what waited inside, and when she reached the door, she didn't knock twice, didn't ask questions, didn't even glance back toward the town that had sent her up here with quiet warnings and half-truths. She simply stood there, calm as the mountains themselves, and when Ethan opened the door, meeting her gaze for the first time, she said only 4 words, soft but certain, like they carried more weight than anything the town had ever whispered, "I will not run." And something in the still air between them shifted, not loud, not sudden, just enough to make the wind pause for a breath, because for the first time in a long while, the story everyone thought they knew was about to change, and neither of them said another word as the doors slowly opened wider, letting her step into a place no one else had ever chosen to stay long enough to understand. The cabin did not change for her, and that was the first thing Nayeli noticed, not the cold air that slipped through the wooden walls, not the quiet that stretched longer than it should, but the way Ethan Cole did not pretend anything was different just because she had stepped inside. He gave her no welcome, no warning, just moved aside and let the door close behind her as the wind pressed once against the wood and then disappeared. And for a while either of them spoke, the kind of silence that was not empty but full of things left unsaid. She set her small bag near the table, eyes tracing the room with slow care, 1 bed, 1 chair, 2 cups though only one showed where, and that was when she saw it, the second plate resting near the edge of the table, clean, untouched, but placed as if someone would return to it at any moment. Ethan noticed her looking but said nothing. Only poured water into a tin cup and set it down within her reach before stepping back again. Always that distance. Always that space he refused to cross, like he understood something about closeness that others did not. The hours passed in small movements, the creak of wood, the soft shift of boots on floorboards, the sound of wind brushing against the roof. And when night came it did not arrive gently, it settled heavy over the mountain, pressing against the windows until the outside world felt farther than it was. Nayeli did not sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because she was listening, and sometime after midnight she heard it, not a voice, not a call, just the faintest movement beyond the door, and she watched as Ethan stood without hesitation, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. He took the second plate, now filled with food she had not seen him prepare, and walked to the door, opening it just enough to step outside before closing it behind him again, leaving her alone with the quiet and the unanswered question that hung in the air like dust in sunlight. She moved slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness, and crossed the room to the door, placing her hand against the wood, feeling the cold seep into her skin. And for a long moment she stayed there, deciding, because this was the moment the others must have reached, the moment when something did not make sense, when leaving would have been easier than understanding. But Nayeli did not step back, she did not turn away, instead she waited, counting the seconds then the minutes, until the door opened again and Ethan returned, empty-handed, his expression unchanged, but there was something different now, something quieter. Like the weight he carried had shifted just enough to be seen if someone chose to look. Their eyes met only for a second, and in that second there was no fear, no challenge, only recognition, as if both of them understood that whatever lived beyond that door was not something meant to be explained, not yet, and Ethan spoke for the first time since she arrived, his voice low, steady, not a warning but not an invitation either, just the truth laid bare in the simplest way possible. Most people leave after that. And Nayeli held his gaze without moving, without hesitation, and answered just as simply, I am not most people, and the wind outside rose again, carrying something unseen across the mountain, something that had already begun to change the story either of them had finished telling. By the third night the pattern had already begun to bend in ways the mountain had not seen before, because Nayeli did not ask about the second plate, and she did not follow him again, not yet. Instead she stayed. And that alone changed the air inside the cabin. The quiet was no longer something that pushed her out but something she leaned into, watching, learning, the way Ethan moved through the space like a man carrying rules no one else could see. He never turned his back fully, never reached without first pausing, never spoke unless the moment demanded it, and still there were signs, small ones, the kind most people miss because they were too busy looking for something louder. The extra blanket folded near the door, worn at the edges like it had seen use beyond the walls, the faint tracks outside the window that did not belong to cattle or horse, and the way Ethan always checked the ridge line just before sunset, not with fear, but with a kind of steady attention. Like he was waiting for something that mattered more than anything the town below could offer. That morning he handed her a tin cup again, the same quiet gesture, and this time she took it without hesitation, their fingers almost touching before he pulled back, always that distance, always that choice, and she understood then that whatever drove the others away was not something he forced, it was something they chose not to face. Later that day she stepped outside alone, the mountains stretching wide and open under the pale sky, the wind carrying the scent of dry earth and distant pine. And she walked just far enough to see what he saw each evening, the ridge rising like a silent wall, the kind of place where shadows held their shape longer than they should, and for a moment she felt it, not fear, but awareness, like the land itself was holding its breath. When she returned he was already there, standing near the door, not asking where she had been, only watching her with that same unreadable calm. And for the first time she spoke without waiting for him, You are not hiding from them, she said, her voice steady, you are protecting something. The words settled between them. Not heavy, not sharp, just true, and Ethan looked at her then, really looked, as if weighing whether she had seen enough to understand or just enough to leave. Most people do not stay long enough to notice that, he said quietly, and she held his gaze without stepping back, without breaking the line that had formed between them. Maybe they were not meant to, she answered, and something shifted. Again, not in the room, not in the wind, but in the space between what was known and what was still hidden. That night came colder than the last, the kind of cold that crept into the bones and stayed there, and when the sound came again. Beyond the door, softer this time, almost like a breath carried on the wind, Nayeli did not wait, she moved before the moment could pass, reaching the door just as Ethan did, and for the first time their hands touched, not by accident, not long, but enough to stop them both for a single second, long enough to understand that whatever waited outside was no longer his secret alone. And when the door opened, the darkness beyond did not feel empty anymore. It felt like something was about to be revealed. The door opened just enough to let the night slip in, cold and quiet, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the mountain itself was watching to see who would take the first step. Then Ethan shifted slightly to the side, not blocking her, not guiding her, just leaving the space open, and Nayeli stepped through, her boots meeting the dry earth outside as the wind brushed past her shoulders, carrying that same faint sound she had heard before. Not quite a call, not quite silence. Something in between, and she followed it with her eyes before she followed it with her steps, moving beyond the edge of the cabin light where shadows stretched longer and the ground dipped toward the ridge. Ethan walked a few feet behind her, not leading, not stopping her, but present, always present. Like a line drawn in the dust that no one crossed without meaning to. The air grew colder as they moved, the kind of cold that settled deep but did not bite. And then she saw it, a small figure. Near the base of a rock barely visible against the dark, still as stone until it shifted just enough to be seen, and everything in the moment slowed, not from fear, but from understanding, because the second plate, the unlatched door, the quiet nights, it all came together without a single word needing to be spoken. The boy did not move toward them, did not run either, just watched, his presence careful, measured. Like he had learned to exist between being seen and staying hidden. Nayeli stopped a few feet away, lowering herself slowly so her height matched his, her hands open at her sides, not reaching, not demanding, just offering space, the same space Ethan had given her when she arrived, and the boy's eyes shifted from her to Ethan, then back again, searching for something that could not be explained, and Ethan remained where he was, not stepping closer, not calling out, simply waiting, because whatever trust existed here was not his to give, it had to be chosen, and after a long moment that stretched like the horizon, the boy moved, just a step, then another, close enough for Nayeli to see the wear in his clothes, the quiet strength in the way he stood, and the story written in the way he watched without speaking. She reached into her pocket and placed something small on the ground between them, a piece of dried bread, simple, ordinary, but offered with the same quiet certainty that had brought her to this place, and she did not push it forward, did not insist, she simply left it there and leaned back slightly, giving him the choice. The wind passed through again, softer now, and the boy stepped forward, slow but sure, taking the bread with careful hands. And in that small movement something shifted, not loud, not sudden, but real, the kind of shift that could not be undone once it began. Nayeli stood then, turning back toward Ethan, and their eyes met in the dim light, and this time there was no distance in it, no question left unanswered, only a quiet agreement that needed no words. But the moment did not last, because from far beyond the ridge came another sound, distant but clear enough to carry through the stillness. The kind of sound that did not belong to the mountain itself. And Ethan's gaze lifted toward it, steady but alert, while Nayeli followed his eyes, understanding without being told that whatever peace existed in this small space was not the only thing moving through the night, and for the first time since she arrived, the story stretched beyond the cabin, beyond the ridge, into something that was coming closer with every passing second. The sound did not belong to the wind, and that was what made it different. Steady, distant, but moving with intention. Across the ridge like something that knew exactly where it was going. Ethan did not speak when he heard it, he did not need to. His body shifted just slightly, enough for Nayeli to see that whatever was coming had already been expected long before she arrived. The boy stepped back into the shadow of the rocks, not in fear, but in habit, like someone who had learned where to stand when the world grew uncertain. Nayeli watched him disappear into the dark and understood then that this place, this quiet space beyond the cabin, had never truly been safe, it had only been protected, and protection was something that could be tested. Ethan turned toward the cabin without urgency, but without delay either. Every movement measured, every step placed like he had walked this same path in his mind many times before. Nayeli followed, not because she was told to, but because she had already chosen. The door closed behind them with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should, sealing the warmth inside against the cold that pressed closer now, and for a moment the cabin felt smaller, not from fear, but from the weight of what was approaching. Ethan moved to the table, not reaching for a weapon, not preparing for a fight, but simply placing another piece of bread on the second plate, the same quiet ritual, the same unspoken promise that whatever happened outside would not change what he had decided inside. Nayeli watched him, then stepped forward, breaking that invisible distance for the first time, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, steady, certain. "They will not understand," she said, her voice calm but clear. Ethan did not look at her right away. His eyes fixed on the door as if he could already see through it. "They never do," he answered. Not bitter, not angry, just stating something that had been proven enough times to become truth. The sound grew closer, no longer carried by the wind but cutting through it, and with it came something else, a tension that stretched across the mountain like a line drawn between two worlds, one that judged without seeing, and one that endured without speaking. Nayeli turned toward the window, her reflection faint against the dark glass. And for the first time she saw herself as the others might. Standing in a place they feared, beside a man they misunderstood, choosing to stay where others had run, and she realized then that the story the town believed was not just about Ethan, it was about anyone who chose not to leave. The floor creaked softly as Ethan stepped toward the door again. His hand resting near the latch, not opening it yet, just waiting, always waiting for the moment to arrive fully before meeting it. Nayeli moved to stand beside him, not behind, not apart, but next to him, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance, and outside the sound finally reached the edge of the cabin, slowing, stopping, and in that stillness just before anything happened, the mountain held its breath. Because what stood beyond that door was not just a test of truth, but a question that neither of them could answer alone. The knock did not come, and that was what made it heavier than any sound. Because whatever waited outside did not need to ask for entry, it already believed it had the right. Ethan stood still with his hand resting near the latch, not tightening, not pulling away, just holding that thin line between inside and out, while Nayeli watched the door as if she could see through the wood itself. Measuring what kind of men would stand in silence instead of announcing themselves, the air inside the cabin grew tighter, not from fear but from knowing, and then a shadow crossed the small gap beneath the door, followed by another, more than one, spaced apart with intention, not scattered, not uncertain. They had come together. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried no panic, only decision, and without looking at her he spoke, low and steady, "If you open that door." There is no explaining it back to what it was. Nayeli did not answer right away, her eyes still on the floor where the shadows shifted faintly with movement outside. Then she stepped forward, closing the last inch of space between them, her voice just as calm. It was never going back. The words settled like dust after a long ride, simple, undeniable, and Ethan finally turned the latch, the door opening just enough to reveal the figures beyond, 3 men from the town below. Their outlines clear in the dim light, not rushing, not raising their voices, but standing with the kind of certainty that came from believing they were right before the first word was spoken. Their eyes moved past Ethan, into the cabin, searching, measuring, judging what they could not understand. One of them spoke, his tone even, controlled. "We heard there is something up here that does not belong." The words hung in the air, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Ethan did not step aside, did not invite them in, just stood where he was, filling the doorway without effort. "Nothing here belongs to you," he said, not as a challenge, not as a threat, just a line drawn where it needed to be. The men exchanged a glance, not surprised, but confirmed. As if his answer fit exactly into the story they had already decided to tell. Behind him, Nayeli did not move back, did not hide. She stepped into the edge of the doorway where they could see her clearly, her presence shifting something in the moment, not enough to stop it, but enough to make it hesitate. One of the men looked at her, then back at Ethan, his voice tightening just slightly. "You have no idea what you are protecting." And this time it was Nayeli who answered, her voice steady, carrying further than it should have in the still air. "Neither do you." The silence that followed was different from before, no longer empty, no longer waiting. It was full of something that could not be turned back into words. And outside, beyond the line of men, the mountain held another presence just out of sight, unseen but not gone, as if the night itself was watching to see which side would step forward first. And in that moment, with the door half open and the truth standing between them, it became clear that this was no longer about what was hidden, it was about who was willing to stand. For when it was finally seen, the air did not move after her words, and that was what unsettled them more than anything, because men who came with certainty expected resistance or fear, not stillness. Not a woman who stood beside the man they had already judged and spoke as if she had seen something they had not. The one in front shifted his weight slightly, not stepping back, but no longer leaning forward either. His eyes narrowing just enough to show that the story he carried was no longer fitting as cleanly as it had before. "You are standing in the wrong place," he said, quieter now, not as a warning, but as a statement he hoped would still hold. Nayeli did not move, her posture unchanged, her voice steady as the ground beneath them. "Or maybe you are." The words did not rise, did not push, they simply existed, and that made them harder to dismiss. Behind Ethan, the cabin remained still, the second plate untouched on the table, the quiet presence of something unseen lingering just beyond the walls, and for a moment the men seemed to sense it, not clearly, not enough to understand. But enough to hesitate. Ethan stepped forward then, not enough to close the door, not enough to force them back, just a single step that made it clear where he stood. "You came a long way to ask a question you already answered for yourselves," he said, his tone even, carrying no edge, just truth, and that truth settled heavier than accusation ever could. The second man glanced toward the ridge, just briefly, as if something there had caught his attention. Something that did not belong to the version of this place they had carried up the mountain. "You are hiding something," he said, but this time the words lacked the strength they had before, and Ethan did not deny it, did not explain it, he simply stood there. Because some things were not meant to be justified to those who had never tried to understand them. The silence stretched again, but now it was different, no longer controlled by the men at the door. It had shifted, and in that shift, something else began to emerge. A presence beyond the line of sight, subtle at first, like the mountain itself. Adjusting, and then clearer, not through sound, but through the way the night no longer felt empty. Nayeli felt it before she saw it, the change in the air, the quiet alignment of something beyond the cabin, and she did not turn, did not look back, because she did not need to. She already knew what stood beyond the ridge. The first man's gaze flickered past Ethan, past the doorway, into the dark behind them. And for the first time since they arrived, uncertainty entered his eyes, not fear, not yet, but something close enough to make him pause, as if he realized that whatever they thought they had come to confront was not alone. Ethan saw it too, the moment their certainty cracked just enough to let something real through, and he did not move to press it, did not step forward or raise his voice, because this was not a moment for force, it was a moment for truth to stand on its own, and sometimes that was enough. The wind returned then, soft but steady, carrying with it the presence that had been waiting, and though no one spoke, the message was clear in the stillness that followed. This place was not empty, it had never been empty. And whatever they chose to do next would not be answered by one man alone. The shift was no longer something only felt, it began to show itself in the edges of the night, in the way the darkness beyond the men at the door seemed to hold shape instead of fading into distance, and one by one, without sound, without warning, figures stepped just enough into the faint light to be seen, not close, not surrounding, just present, standing along the ridge like part of the land itself, still, patient, watching. The kind of presence that did not need to move to be understood. The three men at the door did not turn fully, but their shoulders tightened, their attention splitting between what stood in front of them and what now stood behind, and in that moment the balance changed, not through force, not through words, but through awareness, because the story they had carried up the mountain had only ever included one man, and now they were faced with something larger, something quieter, something that did not fit into the lines they had drawn. Ethan did not step forward, did not claim anything, he simply stood where he had always stood, the same place, the same stillness. But now it was no longer mistaken for isolation, it was seen for what it was, a choice, a line he had drawn long before this night. Nayeli remained beside him, her presence no longer a question but an answer, her eyes steady, not challenging, not pleading, just holding the truth of what she had chosen. And that truth carried further than any argument could have. The first man swallowed slightly, his certainty thinning under the weight of what he could not deny. "You brought them here," he said, but the words lacked conviction, because deep down he knew they had not been brought, they had been there, always there, unseen only because no one had stayed long enough to notice. Ethan shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "They were never gone," he said, and the simplicity of it settled heavier than any defense. The wind moved again, softer now, passing through the space between both sides without choosing one over the other, and in that quiet movement something became clear. This was not a standoff, not a fight waiting to happen. It was a moment of understanding offered without demand, and the men felt it, even if they could not name it. Their posture eased just slightly, not surrender, not acceptance, but something closer to recognition. The second man lowered his gaze for a brief second, as if reconsidering something he had never questioned before, and when he looked back up, it was different, not fully changed, but no longer fixed. "We did not know," he said, almost to himself, and no one answered him, because that was the truth of it. They had not known, and they had not tried to. Nayeli shifted her weight just enough to step forward half a pace, not toward them, not away, just enough to show she stood in the space between both worlds, and her voice came again, quiet but certain. "Now you do." The words did not accuse, did not demand, they simply existed, and in that existence they gave the men something they had not expected when they rode up the mountain, a choice. The silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer sharp. It stretched out wide and open like the land itself, waiting, and for the first time since they arrived, the men did not try to fill it. They stood there, taking in what was in front of them, what was behind them, and what they had almost missed entirely. And slowly, without a word, the first man stepped back, not in defeat, not in fear, but in something quieter, something that looked a lot like understanding beginning to take root where certainty once stood. The first man's step back did not break the moment. It revealed it, because once one moved, the others followed, not quickly, not all at once, but enough to show that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The line that had been drawn in their minds no longer held its shape, and in its place stood something quieter, something harder to argue with. Ethan did not move to close the door, did not mark their retreat as victory. He simply remained where he was, as he had been from the beginning, steady, unchanged, because this had never been about pushing anyone away. It had been about standing firm long enough for the truth to be seen. Nayeli watched the men carefully, not with suspicion, not with relief, but with the same calm she had carried since she arrived. Because she understood that change did not arrive loudly. It came in small steps, in lowered eyes, in the absence of words where there had once been many. The second man glanced once more toward the ridge, where the silent figure still stood, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, and something in that presence seemed to settle the last of his resistance, as if he realized that what stood there was not a threat, but a witness, and witnesses did not need to speak to be understood. "We will head back before sunrise," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, not asking permission, not making a promise, just stating what would be, and Ethan gave a slight nod, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgment, because out here, that was enough. The men turned then, their boots pressing into the dust with a different weight than when they arrived, less certain, more aware, and as they moved away from the cabin, the mountain seemed to breathe again. The tension that had stretched across it loosening into something softer, something closer to balance. Nayeli remained in the doorway, watching until the last of their shapes faded into the distance, and only then did she turn back, the cabin behind her unchanged, the second plate still resting on the table, the quiet still holding its place within the walls. Ethan stepped back inside without a word, leaving the door open just as he always had, and for a moment Nayeli stood there, between the outside and the inside, between what had been and what was now, and she understood that this place was not defined by isolation, but by choice, by the quiet decisions made when no one was watching. She stepped inside and the door remained open behind her, not as an invitation, not as a warning, but as it had always been, a simple truth. The boy appeared again near the edge of the light, no longer hidden as before, his presence easier now, less guarded, and Ethan placed the second plate on the ground just beyond the threshold, stepping back without looking directly at him. The same quiet respect, the same space given, and this time the boy did not hesitate as long. He stepped forward, taking the food, his eyes lifting briefly to meet Ethan's, then Nayeli's. And in that brief exchange something passed between them that did not need language, something built not on fear or misunderstanding, but on recognition. The wind moved once more across the mountain, carrying no tension now, only the soft sound of distance returning to its place. And as the night settled back into itself, it became clear that nothing about the mountain had changed, only the way it had been seen, and sometimes, that was enough to change everything without a single word needing to be said.